I want to welcome everyone here. We've got a great crowd for the Minnesota SAF, Minnesota Society of American Foresters fall meeting here at the Cloquet Forestry Center. And as part of that event, we are recording a presentation by Alan Eck, Department Head in the University of Minnesota's Department of Forest Resources on the state of forestry in Minnesota. The webinar and this talk are sponsored by the U of M Extension and the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. SFEC is based here at the Cloquet Forestry Center. We are going to have Alan talk. We have a total of 1 hour for this presentation. Those of you online can submit questions and answers anytime. Those of you in the room, of course, just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Alan, you'll hear me forward questions from the remote sites. And if you ask a question, those of you in the room, I would ask to don't be shy, project so that they can pick it up, the audio. And Alan, if you're able to briefly repeat the question, that would be helpful. Those of you online, again, I'll share links to the continuing education request forms and a quick evaluation form. I said this before, but those of you here in person, be sure to sign in for those credits. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Alan. Alan, you're on.
Thank you very much, Eli. Thank you for setting all this up, and thank all of you for coming. I'm going to talk a little more freely today than I usually do. This presentation is solely my own, as influenced by many other people, but the Board of Regents are not responsible. Years ago on the farm, my uncle gave me some advice that I used for many years. It was, if you keep your mouth shut, they'll just think you're stupid. If you open it, they'll know for sure. Okay, I got over it. And that's partly why I'm here today, to talk with you. So you have a fellow of some years up here, and I can talk about what I've seen over the years and try to bring some understanding of the long time period to you. I see several others in the room here are approaching my time on this planet, so they probably know as much or more, but they promise to keep their mouth shut until I get done talking, and we'll go from there. So nice to be here. I want to talk about the state of forestry in Minnesota, the state of forests and forestry. And in particular, if we think of this as a road map or trail map, I want to talk about the history of forests and forestry, forest management as we see it today, and some strategies for the future, bearing in mind that our forests are industry, markets, technologies. Of course, these things are changing, and they have been changing for centuries. I'm going to try to look back, way back for a while, then to the present, then beyond, and try to give you a sense of forestry, forest conditions, past and present, and some trade-offs as we look to strategy for the future. And I'm aiming this such that towards the end I'll ask you a question about where you are. And you might just think as we talk then how you or your organization fit into this time frame. So here's Minnesota's forests, and I like this picture with all the roads and agriculture and everything else in it because it is a very well-developed part of the world compared to many others. Very accessible in many ways and very extensive, and we're really talking about a forest region, Minnesota, Ontario, Wisconsin, part of Michigan. It's really a spread out resource, and the different corners have experienced quite different events over time. So 17.3 million acres of forest land, which includes everything that qualifies as a half acre of forest or more, and timberland, which is 17.3 minus that which is reserved from commercial use, or at least timber harvesting as a commercial use, such as the boundary waters, voyage years, etc. Interestingly, Minnesota state government, Minnesota state parks are not really reserved from timber harvesting. They're just harvested in a more unique way and at longer time frames than most of the other landscapes. So Minnesota has a fair amount of semi-protected land as well. If we go back to the history of forests, and I often give a talk to seniors, because I'm so much younger than them, about the history of forests between Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and the U.S. and how those evolved since the Ice Age. Not going to go into that much, but I did want to throw up this glacier to remind you that 20,000 years ago, this spot here looked like that. Times have changed, okay? If we look at, in particular, the history since the 1830s, I think there's more there than meets the eye. Pike, the guy who is responsible for the name of Pikes Peak in Colorado. Pike was sent up the Mississippi in 1803 to, or 1805 through 1806, much like Jefferson and Clark were sent west to find the Pacific in the same time period. President Jefferson sent people here, there, and a number of places. And Pike's journals and stories up the Mississippi in that time period then give us some insight there. Like Lewis and Clark, he found that the North American Native Americans had really suffered a lot from the European plagues that we brought over, and their numbers were much reduced by the early 1800s. Pike came up the Mississippi, and let's see, what should we say about, I know that he stopped along a place close, a little bit north of Aiken, Minnesota. I've got a cabin a little north of Aiken, and so he was probably 3 miles from my cabin, and it's the middle of Aiken County, and he described it, or his crew described it as scattered oak and pine and buffalo and elk. And a nearby lake was named Elk Lake. So the world was different. We were open. We had oak and pine, and he then made it up all the way to Cass Lake, and then struggled back overland and did live to tell that story. But that was a story when the forests were fairly open. If we move forward to the, and we can assume that the tribes in the area were actively managing the land. And I don't know if anybody here has read Charles Mann's book, 1491, just before Columbus arrived. You know, just a fascinating story about the early development by Native Americans, North and South America. A tremendous amount of development that we kind of forget about nowadays. So early settlement around Stillwater, the early lumber mills, 1840s. And that's about the time, the late 1840s, when the Public Land Survey began, and then it was more or less finished by the late 1870s. And that caught us a picture of the forest, where the forest was, in fact, maybe much denser than it was in 1800. After the tribes got really knocked back in terms of numbers, there was less active tribe management of lands, and I think our forest kind of thickened up. And our primeval look then from the land survey is maybe a little different than it might have been 100 years earlier. Well, then things really took off in 1865, right after the Civil War, and we saw much settlement and great land clearing to build the cities of the Midwest from Chicago to Omaha, with the wood out of Wisconsin and Minnesota in that period. And to give you an idea of the timber harvest, today the harvest is about 2.83 million cords of wood per year. The 1899 harvest, as best I can tell, and it takes a little bit of guesswork, was about 12 million cords. So you can figure that we were harvesting 8 to 10 million cords for several years through that period, late 1890s and early 1900s. So we managed to clear a lot of land, primarily clearing it for agriculture. And then along came the 1930s to the 1970s. The forest was regrowing, and we began to see something called silviculture actually thought about and applied on the landscape. It's when we first recognized this wall of wood coming back, where great land clearing in a relatively short period of time, and then this wall of regeneration moved forward And you can still see pieces of it today. And that was harvested in large part to build the Midwest and the post-war demand after World War II for about 20 years or more. We had a tremendous housing boom. You could find a 2x4, it went into the building fast. Then from 1970s to 1990s, we saw the advancement of environmental concern. 1972, the first Earth Day, and that led to concerns about rates of harvesting in different parts of the world. In our part of the world, we saw the petitioning for the generic environmental impact statement on timber harvesting and forest management. That lasted about 4 years, 90 to 94, and it led to a pretty strong technical update of what we knew about forests in the Midwest. So what we had coming out of that were projections of impacts from timber harvesting and forest management, and projection of future forest conditions all the way out to 2040. And a check, since that was first done about 10 years after the GEIS, our projections were not too far off. We're following several of them pretty closely, both in terms of forests and wildlife, etc. And despite that environmental concern, industry really expanded and moved forward in the late 1990s, despite the decline in the federal timber supply, which started to decline back in the late 80s. And we almost reached the magical 4 million cord harvest level the GEIS specified as a modest level higher than what we had before, but still pretty modest. And then there were projections that harvest could be as high as 5 or 5.5 million cords and really not disturb much, or maybe even 7 million cords if you really invested. And we all know that forests are kind of like grass. The faster you whack them down, the faster this stuff seems to grow. Some of you are probably setting up the same timber sale or a timber sale in the same stands that you cut years ago. So our forests, a picture of the forests from the Ice Age to right around 2000. And if we talk a little bit more about that, when we look from 1930 on in particular, and that's the first, 1935 was the first statewide FIA survey. Just an aside, we're now looking through the books such as we can find them on the 1935 survey of Minnesota, 120,000 plots, whatever, trying to rebuild that data set so we can compare it with what we're looking at today. So from 1990 or 1930 up to 1990, Minnesota harvested about 3 million cords a year, every year, including firewood. 3 million cords a year from 1930 up until the mid-1990s. And it looks like things are maybe sustainable, that you can do that almost forever. Then in the 1990s, as I mentioned, we approached 4 million cords per year by the end of the decade. Today we're back at about 2.8 or 3 million cords if you include the firewood. What we've seen along the way are new technologies in the wood and mills. I mean, let's see, back in the 1920s, I know members of my family were cutting trees down like this. And then we got to the chainsaw where one really quick person could take down about an acre of popple a day. And now we're looking at 10 to 15 acres can be taken down in a day. A lot of technology in the woods and the mill. We've increased the mechanization at almost every step. Interesting number here is the utilization percent of the wood that we harvest. And Jim Boyer at Forest Products impressed this upon me that for the last 70 years, we've seen a 2% increase in the utilization of what we harvested per year. In other words, if we harvested a tree 10 years ago and used whatever we did, today we're using that plus another 2%. And there are a number of mills where wood goes in and nothing comes out except dollars. I mean, there is no leftover material. If you've been to Pete Aubie's mill over by Cass Lake, you can see a pretty good example of that. Towards the end, you can choose between 5 different grades of sawdust. So everything really gets utilized. Compared to back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we had these tremendous sawmill dust or sawdust piles. Those are all gone. If you're born today, you won't see a sawdust pile at a sawmill anymore. And we have a number of new products on the horizon, such as the nanomaterials, all kinds of funny materials. I guess the screen here is made out of a cellulosic product. So your iPhone screen might be wood. We have a number of bioplastics and fuel possibilities. We've got Sappi over here, which produces fiber for the fabric market. We've got cross-laminated timbers, which now allow rather tall buildings. The Swedes are building some 6 to 10 story skyscrapers now with cross-laminated glued timbers. And increasingly, with the fight over green building standards, we're seeing timber increasingly viewed as a green material. And from an energy standpoint, certainly it's a green material compared to steel. I always hated those steel 2x4s, you know, they kind of wave and then you whack them hard, and so irritating. So I do favor wood for those kinds of things. So a lot has happened in the area of harvesting and utilization trends. Let's talk a little bit about the forests, and the things that I'd like to illustrate to you are age-class distributions, really fundamental for a discussion of sustainability, forest type acreage change, managing the age-class distribution, mortality rates and trends, and growth rates overall. And like you, as I walk through this, think of where your territory, whether you're looking after a part of a district or a part of a larger area, where does your forest lie in these descriptions? So let's start with the age class distribution. This is statewide. It's Timberland, and it shows the number of acres by 20-year age class up to 121 plus. For 1977, the dark bar, and then progressively lighter through 1990, 2003, 2008, and 2013. And what you see here then is, beginning in 1977, here's this wall of wood coming forward from the heavy harvesting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That's the wall of wood. And we see that in 1977 we had rather small amounts of older material, 100 years, 120 years, actually not a lot of 80-year-old stuff. And if you take the freeway from here down to the Twin Cities, you won't see many stems that are over 80 years of age. That was pretty clear when I was a kid. Driving up Highway 61 to come up here, pretty open back in the last century. And so here's what happened. That wall of wood moved forward. 3 million cords a year were taken out of it. And in fact, that really wasn't enough to cut it off, so to speak. And we have then an increasing amount, 3 or 4 times as much older material, over 100 years old, than we had in 1977. That's really how fast it can happen. Folks think the forest is rather slow growing, but 20 years, the age classes can really change. So that's our wall of wood moving forward. And we've gone from a forest that was fairly young and headed by this wall to one now that is increasingly into older age classes. If you take 60 as a typical rotation age, not necessarily the best, but typical for what people tend to fall upon, most of our stuff, increasing amount of stuff, is now older than that 60. So that's the age class distribution. What does your forest look like? And this I put up, and I later on I'm going to run a quiz on what several of these numbers are from the back row. But I thought I would put this in color, and I thought that this slideshow might be available on the web later so that you might look at it in a bit more detail. In red, and not that it's necessarily the end of the world, but jack pine and balsam fir are two species in terms of, or two cover types that have lost a lot of acreage in the last 30 years. Jack pine is just a shade more than half of what it was in 1977. Why? Well, since the 60s and 70s, when we moved our harvesting from focusing on jack pine for pulpwood to aspen, the demand for jack pine has fallen off, and we haven't been harvesting and regenerating it. And that's why we've gone from 450,000 acres to 240,000 acres. Similarly, over the period of the last 25 years, we've removed a lot of balsam fir for pulp and paper purposes out of stands that were formerly heavily to that, maybe a mixed balsam fir and aspen, or maybe just balsam fir. We still have an equally large number of balsam fir trees, but the acreage of that cover type is much reduced. It's gone from 800,000 acres to under 400,000 acres. Now I colored some of the cover types in orange because it's not really a problem, so to speak. It's more a question of how we want to manage these. And the acreage change is important, but not so dramatic. Aspen, we started out in '77 with over 5 million acres. Now we're down more than 10% less than that. Still a lot of aspen out there, and there's a lot of aspen and other cover types. But the acreage of aspen is down. Why? Because we've harvested it less intensively. We've left a lot of residuals. A number of acres of aspen after the harvest turn out to be maple or mixture of hardwoods or balsam fir, whatever. So selective harvesting, you leave a lot of residuals, you won't get as much aspen back, and I suspect that's a major reason for that acreage decline. As we all know, if you really clear-cut aspen, you'll get a lot of aspen back. Birch is a modest decline in acreage, and if you drive around, particularly in the Northeast, you see a lot of birch kind of dying. It doesn't live that long, especially on shallow, droughty soils, and it's going to take a pretty good market to bring us back into acreage for birch. Also poplar, a companion of aspen for pulp and paper and other purposes. It's really hard to tell. And here I'll throw out a caveat. Even statewide FIA numbers are hard to get too precise with them, because FIA often does not tell you what they did in terms of getting the new numbers compared to what they had for procedures or definitions with the older numbers. So we really didn't gain 1 million acres in 13 years here of forest land. 1977, the procedures appeared to really penalize lowland, swampy forest types where the trees weren't very large and they were presumed to be largely unproductive. And a lot of other land that was coming back, the survey procedures tended to, I shouldn't say underestimate, but did not take full account of their productive potential. And so we have seen some gains in acreage of forest in Minnesota, but not that fast. And then we see it was fairly stable in this part, but procedures really changed in 2003. And in particular, the U.S. went from the 20% cover per acre defining a forest to the global standard of 10%. And all of a sudden we picked up some more acres, but you won't find that in an FIA footnote over this period. And so we clearly have less forest in southwestern Minnesota. The Aggies have been removing that pretty fast. And we have seen a consolidation of forest in the northern part of the state as a 40 or an 80 farmstead kind of disappears one day. And those people move to town and they don't occupy as much acreage. And so our northern forest acreage has been creeping up as well. But you really need to dig into the data. If you just look at the numbers, say, big jump, another big jump. A lot of this is definitions and procedures. It's increasing, but in funny steps. And then these gray cover types here, they're more or less the same. And I've just said we'll give them a pass. Black spruce has added acres, but I'm not really sure it's really added acres. I think this was back when low site black spruce was simply left out of the survey as unproductive. Similarly with tamarack, and of course in southern Minnesota we're getting some eastern red cedar. So we can put this together. Think of where you are in the state. And then I'm looking at changing not just acreage, but age class distributions. And I'll show you a slide and emphasize the color for 1977 and then today. In 1977, we had this wall of wood in the 40 to 60-year-old age class with 4.7 million acres. That was really the highest point in our age class distribution, and relatively little old stuff. 150, 70,000 acres of stuff over 120 years of age. Or if you take, you might say, throw that in with this, and that's 450,000 acres of material over 100. Now when I go to the next slide, you'll see the yellow marked peaks staying in the middle somewhat, maybe a little more spread out, and more orange, older stuff on the right. So we've seen our forests grow older, and we're now accumulating acres in cover types at quite advanced age. We're still in the middle in terms of where the peak age class distribution is. Instead of 40 to 60 as a peak, it's now 60 to 80, or on, let's say on the average 20 years older. But we have now, in terms of material 100 years or older, we've got 1 million acres of forest out there that is over 100 years of age. So we're not exactly running out of older forest. Some of these types don't get up there because they flat out don't live that long. I think this is just a really ornery balsam fir. It's just hung around. They just don't make it that far. Northern white cedar, I could believe that.
Alan,
yeah.
We have a question submitted online. First one I think we've answered. Just confirming that this is all based on FIA data. If there's anything further you want to say about that, you can. But the other one is someone said, I thought tamarack was declining fairly dramatically. Has that just not been picked up given the timing, or any comments on that?
There is a little bit of a question is, what about tamarack and its dynamics? And if we look back at tamarack, back here we're noticing that tamarack has gone from 491,000 acres to 700, 800, 900, whatever. Those wetlands are accumulating acreage that now looks like forest. And I suspect there was a lot of early clearing that removed the trees from those acreages prior to 1930, and now it's coming back. If we go forward then, in terms of 1977, tamarack, we see it a fairly even distribution of the first 4 or 5 age classes with tamarack. And if we go farther with tamarack, we're seeing an accumulation then of 20 to 40 year old, I should even add 20 to 40 and 60-year-old tamarack. So in terms of the acreage of what FIA calls tamarack, It does not look like it's declining, but certainly we have health issues in tamarack with, I'm not sure I have the slide here, that insect problems in tamarack are, have been really devastating over the last few years. I always like to look at FIA because they're out there, they're covering the whole state, 5,000 plots more or less, and the numbers that come out are instructive and more so than most. Let's look at this. We looked at age class distribution, so I want to quit there. The point I want to emphasize here is that we have a lot more older stuff now, 1 million acres of older material, more than double, almost triple what we had 30 years ago. And we still have a peak of a distribution in the roughly 40 to 80 year range, but it's a bit more spread out. And it probably suggests our utilization over time and to some species insect and disease problems. Let me look at one in particular. White pine, we have quite a bit more white pine acreage than we used to have. The difficulty here is that while we've been somewhat successful in getting new white pine going since the 1990s with an emphasis on it, in order to provide 44,000 acres of white pine in the 60 to 80 year class, you got to have 44,000 in this class, and 44,000 in that class, and 44,000 in that class. So we're collecting more older white pine. We're not necessarily producing new acres, restoring those acres or replanting them, whatever, at a rate that's ultimately 50 years from now going to give us a lot of white pine. And you might say the same thing with red pine. We have a lot of red pine going forward in the 20 to 40-year-old class and now being thinned, and certainly in the 40 to 60. But there's not enough in the 0 to 20 to keep us there. That's the way I'm reading this, is you really want as many acres in each class, an equal number of acres in each class, and if you're short in a younger class, that means you're going to be operating at a lower level going forward. That's the whole idea of sustaining a harvest level and sustaining the forest. If we talk about mortality, 99 to 2013, that's about 4 million cords per year mortality. And I have a graph of this, 4 million cords per year. The harvest is only 3. We are really doing good at collecting mortality in Minnesota. If we look at the causes, as best you can tell, and pathologists have told me that when a tree dies, at the time it dies, it's really hard to tell exactly when it did die, and also what that primary cause was. Here's FIA's description of primary causes. About half due to weather, disease, insects, animals, fire, a little bit of human and other damage, and about half that's unaccounted for. And the unaccounted for, I think, is what people who study mortality come to believe. That's the competition-based mortality. If we were managing well, we should be able to save a lot of this mortality through thinning. We should be able to retain some of this rather than losing it by thinning practices that foster health. So where is your forest? If you're any grouse hunters in here? Any grouse hunters in here? Good. Okay, you're walking through the woods in Minnesota this fall. Study we did several years ago with FIA. There are about 15 or 16 dead trees, standing dead trees per acre in Minnesota. It's pretty evenly spread across public and private, except up on the Superior National Forest, it's about 24, 25 dead trees per acre. Now, having worked on the Superior as a youth on Forest Survey, an area with a lot of openings, Superior is really closed in from the time I could drive my Jeep anywhere. And the number of standing mortality trees is pretty high. So we've accumulated a lot of standing dead over there. It causes me to laugh. I had a wildlife friend. Well, I had a wildlife person that I knew. And he wanted so very much for forestry practices to leave 1 or 2 dead trees or cull trees per acre. I'd say we've satisfied his concern. 15 should do it. We should have turkeys and grouse. We should probably have to put on protective gear to walk through the woods. So let's look where this has taken us, particularly the last 20 years, which prior to that we were more active managers, maybe not as sophisticated as equipped technologically, but we were out trying to, in large part, move wood, and society had real demand for it. In the last years, since the late 80s, whatever, and leading up to 2000, say, we moved to a softer form of silviculture where we try to protect the forest. After all, it only been here 5,000 or 10,000 years, unlikely to last, and it only came 1,000 miles to get here. So this is tender stuff. You really need to take care of this stuff. While you're here on Earth, take care of the forest. Don't hurt it. So we've moved to a softer form of silviculture. I think realistically more of a focus on diversity, reduced investment, though, in the practices that promote productivity, more on practices that foster a protective view and to some extent diversity, although I'm not sure those strategies really work. What we see then is somewhat reduced site preparation, planting, certainly planting and weed control. We used to plant 30,000 acres a year. Now we're barely planting 10,000 acres a year in Minnesota from the nursery and silvicultural surveys. And that's partly why you're not seeing this continued buildup of red pine acreage. We're not planting as much red pine as we used to. A little bit more emphasis on TSI and early thinnings, but it's still only 10 to 12% of the harvest out there. Again, increasing acreage of older forest because we were told that's really what God wanted us to do and to take care of the wildlife. Health and productivity concerns, we've seen diminished timber and wildlife habitat values, even though we took on the softer approach to improve that. Increased mortality, fire fuel loads are higher. We've got 5 times the standing biomass per acre in terms of fuels today than we had in 1930. This is we're ready for another big fire. Actually, UFRO, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, put out a study in the last year globally, and their advice is that much of the world, with a little bit of climate change, but in particular developed countries that have more and more forest, are more and more in danger of large forest fires. So it's not just a Minnesota issue, it's global. And then we have the challenges of deer, climate change, and invasive species, non-trivial, certainly the deer, and more of a focus on diversity and strategies that will foster resilience in the face of change. And I think these are appropriate. In my lifetime, the deer have been the biggest one. I suspect they will continue to be a big one for quite a while, but we will see more. That's forest management today. What else can we say about forest management? I wanted to talk about the economic and operational challenges for government and industry investment in forest management. Forest management capability is obviously tied to the logging infrastructure, which is a big subject in the current industry competitiveness study chartered by state government. And vice versa, the logging infrastructure and its capability is very much a function of our management. The infrastructure has become highly constrained by an increasingly short winter harvest season. 60% of the wood or more comes out of 3 or 4 months. we will need to move more of that harvesting season to the summer, or we will lose our forest management capability. It's really hard to keep a company going when you only have maybe 4 months worth of work each year, and several months of those are uncertain. And the last year was probably the worst in the sense of, over the last few years we've had relatively modest winters, so company accountants cut back on their mill inventories. And then we had a problem with biofuel in parts of Minnesota where we had several bad batches in the last winter, and even good fuel oil has a difficult time operating when it's more than 30 below. We had a number of those days. And then we had a very wet spring, and so it was very hard to get out the usual amount of wood. We need to move to more summer harvesting, and I'll give you a slide suggesting the possibilities in a moment. Non-industrial private forest owners, family forest owners, were more than half of the timber supply back in the early 2000s. Since the economy went bad, they've been really slow to return, partly because the state and companies have reduced their private forest management advising in terms of numbers of people, and they just haven't felt from an economic standpoint the prices look good enough, a variety of reasons depending on the part of the state, why they are now only a third of the timber supply instead of half, which puts more pressure on public lands. Another thing is the Minnesota environmental review processes, not the standards, but the processes as they have evolved in state government, really make Minnesota a flyover state for forestry investment. It's much cheaper and faster to approve a new plant or facility or an improvement in North Carolina, in Louisiana, in Scotland, you name the place, than it is to get that through Minnesota's increasingly tight process. And there have been some steps in the last year or two to help that, but it is still not, we're not bringing a lot of planes down with investment money. They're still flying over us. Then we have this gradual, increasingly risk-adverse behavior of natural resources personnel with the gradual greening of government. Environmental organizations used to be outside government. Now they really are inside. The people we've produced in the last 30 or 40 years are now. Some of our folks are really inside state government and not particularly interested in disturbing the environment. And then we see, along with that, is decision-making, which used to be in the hands of 1 or 2 people or organizations in government, now have 7, 8, 12 people involved in different parts of government in terms of approving a timber sale, for example. So it really slows the situation down. And government agencies are increasingly, I think, disinclined to consider the economic implications of forest management and harvesting. And I think that also means they're less and less involved with critical trade-off analysis, more of a consensus decision-making than a precise look at the situation. We might take some of this in mind and consider timber supply. In Minnesota, we've got harvest levels, if we throw in the firewood, we're maybe up to 3.3 million. Here's our sustainable harvest level, the maximum that came out of the generic environmental impact statement study, assuming current levels of management, assuming we do it just like we've been doing it for decades. This is the actual harvest. Here's the current net growth. Here's the mortality. Where would you go first? Well, let's see if we can't recapture some of this and then make this higher so we can make that a lot higher. But if you're going to continue to manage the forest where this is high, that's high, and this is low, we are going to accumulate old forest, more firewood, more forest fuels, lesser habitat values for critters that live on the forest floor. It's not where I want to go. And so it takes me to strategies for the future. We need a strategy for the future. How are we doing for time, Eli?
You got about 15 minutes before 1 o'clock, Alan.
We're going to do this then quick. If you're going to manage this forest, take a look at the age class distribution. Focus on the most economic age classes first. They are going to pay for the rest of the operation. Plan for capturing these older age classes before they are lost through mortality. Try younger rotation ages. We're so risk adverse nowadays that it does bother some to whack things down earlier or to thin earlier and earlier. Give it a try. It's now called adaptive management. It doesn't take a monumental decision group to do so. And it, just like grass in many cases, it will grow faster as you treat it faster. We want to invest in silviculture that fosters growth, quality. Quality has become increasingly important. Old rotten wood doesn't do well in processes, manufacturing processes. Health, diversity in its many forms, and resilience as we move forward to more change. So we'd like to see, if we're going to be successful, more emphasis on site preparation, planting, weed control, rapid early growth and avoiding browsing, early thinning, capturing mortality, a really big one, more emphasis on management such that timber and wildlife habitat values really rebound. Need more disturbance out there for summer harvesting. In fact, if we look at summer harvesting and look at the proportions of our forest by cover type that are in dry versus wet versus relatively in between situations, we'll see that we have really a lot of acres. 70% of our forest is not in a swamp. And yet we're spending most of the time in the winter in the swamp and not much elsewhere in the summer. Interesting about this too is that we probably know a lot about the ecological conditions for many species if we simply observe whether our feet are wet. Okay? Almost all of these cover types are found on but one or two or at the most three of these conditions. Black spruce and tamarack, 95% of the time we find them in swamps and bogs. I don't necessarily need a complicated guidebook to tell me about the ecological conditions there. If we look at white pine, we're looking at about 90% on two kinds of physiographic conditions, largely dry. Similarly for red pine, similarly for jack pine. We go down to northern hardwood similarly. So while we have 6 or 7 physiographic classes, any particular cover type, you're going to largely find it in a relatively narrow set of conditions. That's the way nature tends to work. If we look at wildlife habitat, we have a number of tools now in terms of habitat suitability indices to look at to see how we're doing with habitat. And I'm just going to talk about these numbers because there's too many here. But basically, we have habitat suitability indices coming out of the GEIS and refined since that allow us to look statewide over a number of decades, 77 in this case to 2013, to look at roughly how 200 different but bird and animal species are doing. And when we look at those indices over time, we see a lot of our canopy-related critters doing pretty well, large positive percent changes. We see our large mammals, mooses, not doing all that well, but deer and a number of critters are doing fine. Obviously, rust grouse could use more aspen. And our threatened, endangered, and special concern species, they're down, not necessarily because of forestry, but not very much. So we have an ability now to look at statewide, regionally, more locally, what our management is doing with respect to these critters. Anybody here ever seen an eastern hognose snake? Anybody ever see one?
Well,
Southern Minnesota.
yeah, southern Minnesota.
Yeah. So it's not much of an issue up here, but it does show on a chart, and depending on where you are, you might or might not want to pay attention to that one, or several of the others here. So we have a capability to look at that. I wanted to leave you with a little bit of math. And the question is, what does a meaningful harvest level look like? You look at the GEIS, it was 4 million cords of harvest annually out of 14.8 million acres of timberland. That was the harvest specification tested, or one of the 3 tested in 1994. That amounts to harvesting 0.27 or a quarter of a cord per acre per year. Not a tremendous growth rate, but that amounts to a quarter of a cord. I'm asking, what is your acreage producing? What is your timberland acreage producing? And I've looked at the national forest, a number of counties, a bit of state government, not statewide, but in regions. Most of us are not up to 0.27, which is a modest level of forest management. And some are down to half of that. But it's a fairly easy piece of math. How many acres of timberland do you have? What's a number to aim for in terms of a respectable level of management? And a lot of benefits with that in terms of jobs, etc. Jobs, tax revenue, program revenues. Public agencies are used to working on the basis of budgets. They've gotten away from looking at benefits from harvesting, but in fact, a number of benefits can fall forward as they demonstrate proficiency in reaching some target level. I'm going to skip this one, but this is really ways that we might work in silviculture to manage this change and improve our targeting in terms of harvesting going forward. There are some real benefits, shorter rotation ages, improved economic returns, substantial carbon storage as you pack it away, favors light demanding species, more understory growth, flexibility, adaptation with, let's say, climate change, longer rotations, reduced revenue, older forests, shade tolerant species, less carbon storage, reduced adaptive capability. It's almost a no-brainer. So my big question to you, going back and repeating it, is where are you and your land in this mix of possibilities? I say, where are you? Where are you? I think we need to think about that as we go through the days and weeks of not making many substantial decisions. Where are you and your lands in this mix of possibilities? And my friend here will help with any questions that are difficult.
Any questions from here? Bob, go ahead.
What are the, you mentioned the age distribution. Did you look at that based on ownership? Sense I have is that like the non-industrial private forests are probably tend to be older because of lack of
any activity. Yeah, so in terms of age class distributions by ownership, public lands tend to be older ages. The private lands, like you suggest, haven't been worked on much in the last decade and are aging. Say state, county, and industry lands probably look the most vigorous in terms of the age class distribution. And it's interesting going around the state. You can see some counties are doing extremely well and they have some good markets to help with that, and other counties that might not have those markets are not being able to do as well.
Great, just a quick note for those online, I did put the links in for the continuing education credits. Those of you here, if you signed in, you're good to go, but online, take a look for those. I have one question here online, but any others from the room here in Cloquet? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, early in the presentation you showed age classes and different kinds of data came from 1977 up to today. Is there any changes in the quality of those acreages, the standing timber?
As we look at the age classes, are there any changes in the quality? I would say the quality of timber in Minnesota is very much a function of size until it gets past rotation age, and then decay, particularly aspen and insect and disease problems, really show up. It's more a function of the age of that age class rather than any trend over time in terms of quality. So if that helps answer your question. No, I don't think the insect and disease problem has changed a great deal, for example, between 1977 and today with respect to quality. But with more older stuff, yes, we're seeing the volumes available at age 60. Trees are still standing until age 80, but there is the same or the less volume in them. They are not producing more beyond that because of this accumulation of problems with age. With a few exceptions, some of us are still in great shape despite aging.
Great presentation, very good. The question is, how is the state moving forward as a group in addressing these strategies for implementation? Because time is critical, and we're seeing that very apparent this summer in terms of mill inventories, wood availability, change in harvest cost. We need to do something sooner than later. So what is going on in the state in further developing these strategies and implementing them?
I think it's slow. I think it will speed up here in December. That is the adaptation to suggested changes with the report of the competitiveness study in December. Subtly, I think some accountants and mills have decided to listen to their woodland manager and maybe carry more wood in the yard. That's about every 5 or 10 year change of heart. But I think we still have to make a real move on environmental review in the state and get people to understand, I think, that these gradually accumulating older age classes are really not helping necessarily with the old growth question. Just for aesthetics, they are not helping with habitat much at all. More critters and better habitat really come out of healthy, thrifty forests.
Alan, the question online goes back to the data you showed earlier. I noticed a steep decline in young white cedar. Is there a reason for that?
Is there any young white cedar? I saw one on a tour at Blandon a couple of years ago. It was about this tall. And a day later it was gone. That's about we simply don't seem to be able to regenerate white cedar unless there's an enclosure situation, which is very expensive.
Back to the age class, Dave, I didn't get a chance to look at it real closely, but we have a lot of old forests. What proportion of that is in lowland conifers and in bottom hardwoods? And they're there because there's not a market, or the rotation ages over the 100 years?
The black spruce and tamarack acreage, largely swamps and bogs, has been stable for a number of decades. Not too many other creatures want to go in there. Lowland hardwoods has been accumulating. That's the riparian, the low flatwoods, accumulated quite a bit over the last 30 years, and its markets, its accessibility. I'm not sure we have a good cure for that unless we added a lot of industry to Minnesota. The unique thing about Minnesota in terms of industry is we actually have great diversity compared to many states in terms of our vegetation. It's so diverse that it's difficult to make a market. You need 1 million acres of something before you really can establish a market. We have aspen at 4 or 5 million acres. Everything else is about 1 million, or less. So these lowland species, it's just very difficult to get something going unless we make it very easy for that market to develop.
Any other questions here? All right, well, let's thank Alan for a good presentation.